David McCoy, he looks younger than his experience shows, right?
That's right.
The world of employment law, labor, pitfalls, traps, issues. He's seen a lot of it, and when I first met him, he had some great, not just concepts to share, but real life situations that a lot of companies today are having to deal with in the recruiting and employing and retaining and then terminating process. So he comes with a host of stories and a lot of wisdom. So I want to welcome Nate McCoy.
All right. Thank you. Appreciate that. All right. Okay, well, thank you for having me. It's always nice to be able to speak with people about what I do. It's interesting. People have asked me, how did you get into employment law, or why do you do employment law? Well, it's pretty simple. Job security, okay? I think that's one of the big issues. It's because, look, there are always employers, there are always employees, and there are always disputes, right? I mean, that's just the way this works. So employability is one of the reasons why I chose it. But the other issue is interesting. There are always problems that need solving, right? Working with people, working with companies. How can we fix things to make businesses run better, to make employees' lives happier? So that's what I really enjoy, and that's why I got into employment law. But a little bit about me. I am a local guy. I went to high school here in Orlando, and then also went on to college at the University of Central Florida, Go Knights. I then went on to the University of Tennessee to get my JD. And that was a fun experience, and then came back home because that's where the heart is, right? Home is where the heart is. I have worked at the second largest labor and employment law firm in the country, and so I kind of cut my teeth there. So that was a fun experience, getting to work with Fortune 500 companies. But now what I really enjoy is working with small businesses, mid-sized businesses, to help make sure that they do things the right way. That I get a lot of enjoyment about. It's just a great area of practice. I've seen a lot, and I'm hoping that I can share what I have seen with you and kind of impart some wisdom and knowledge, and perhaps dissect some of your own issues. I know that sometimes people don't have a lot of access to an attorney, but I'm here. So this part of the presentation is really for you. However it goes, I'll go through slides. You guys have them, and so that will be kind of the base for us of what we're talking about. Then I'll try to throw in some war stories in as we go. But then if you have any questions, if you have any particular issues that your company's facing or that you want to talk about, I'm willing to do so, okay? It's a great time to do it. So let's have some fun this morning, all right? Okay, employee retention. What is it exactly? Obviously, it's about trying to retain talent. That's what we're looking to do, and I think it's a very hard thing to do, especially if an economy is booming, right? Trying to keep people within your company. And so if we look at the importance here, what you're looking at, it's often overlooked, but you want to retain talent because you're trying to retain institutional knowledge. You're trying to make sure that your morale is high and that you have satisfied customers and you continue to make great sales. But the problem is when you don't retain those individuals, when you have a lot of turnover, what do? You have to switch gears. You go from that to you have concerns of hiring, right? You have to get into the hiring issue, and it becomes costly. You also have people going out who are now competing, right, with your business, where you have to try to stop that. Also costly. Keeps me in business, but also costly. So those are the issues that you often deal with employee retention, and I'm hoping I can kind of help you guys a little bit with that. Now, I laugh at the first bullet point here, and you guys can kind of follow along, but most employers think that the number one reason for someone to leave a company is money. That's a lie. I will tell you it's a lie, and the reason why I know that is because I have had to depose a number of people on almost a weekly basis, and plaintiffs usually, or someone who's left the company for a non-compete issue, and they will say it's not because of money. It's because of some other reason. It's because of another issue of dissatisfaction with the job. We have issues up here where they felt unappreciated, they're being overworked, or they have poor management. So those are the real reasons, I will tell you, why people leave. Now, of course, some people do leave for money, but these are the main reasons that I have seen. When people do leave, You can't always stop someone from leaving, and everyone's not going to be happy at a job. But when they do, there are strategies that we can employ to make sure that you protect the company. And that includes, of course, things like non-competes, non-solicitations. But those are things that we can do through restrictive covenants, just to make sure that you try to retain people as well, or at least don't lose out on some of your valuable information. The first key thing that I would say is that don't set your organization up for failure. Make sure you hire the right way, okay? I love the first bullet point. Effective retention of employees begins with effective hiring. I've found that to be extremely true, and I've counseled a lot of clients on this. A lot of companies, and I don't know if yours actually does it or not, but when you get these loads of resumes that you're looking at, it's easy for people and natural for you to identify with those who are like you, right? It's just a normal thing to do. You see people who have went to the same college as you, the same hometown, or, hey, that's a buddy of mine, right? Well, nothing could be more demoralizing than to hire someone who's not actually qualified. So while those are good factors, they're not the things that you should consider as the first priority. You want to make sure that someone's actually qualified for the job for which they've applied and which you're hiring for. That's the key here. The other things you should look at here is, okay, does someone have, or has someone kind of bounced around? You always look at that in looking at a resume. If I see on the first page 9 or 10 jobs, that's a sign of potentially someone who's going to continue to move around, or they're just a bad employee altogether. So obviously you want to look at these things when you're doing your hiring practices, when you're looking at your resumes. You also want to make sure that you're asking employees, do you have a non-compete? Is there something we should be concerned of if we were to hire you? Are we going to be at risk? Now, I will say this. An enforceable non-compete doesn't mean you won't hire or can't hire that employee. In fact, it sometimes can be an opportunity to sort of negotiate. One of my clients recently lost 3 employees. They were kind of lower level employees to a competitor. But at the same time, they were hiring for an upper level management position. And within that, they hired that employee. So there were 2 opposite companies, right? So of course, they each send out cease and desist letters saying, you've hired my employee, stop this, or we're going to actually go to court and get into a lengthy lawsuit. Well, we ended up negotiating a deal, kind of like horse trading, if you will, with 3 for 1 is kind of what we did. So the point is that there may be an enforceable non-compete, but that doesn't mean you can't hire them. You might be able to work out a deal with the other employer. So if you see someone who's going to be valuable to your organization, they're well qualified, they're going to enhance sales, don't give up on that person. Perhaps see if a deal can be made, because generally it can. One of the things is when you're actually interviewing somebody too, is actually going through and making sure that they're a good fit. I don't think that there's enough of that where people go through the basics when they're asking questions during interviews. And I know interviewing can be tough because you have to be fairly sterile in the questions that you ask today. Otherwise, you can face a lawsuit. But what you can ask is about the person's, their interests, their hobbies. Are they things that are actually tied to what you see in your own organization? You're trying to look for the heart and soul of that person and how they're going to translate to your business. If you find that right fit, they're going to be someone who's going to last a while. So you're trying to always look for that fit. But one thing that I practice and preach for most of my clients is that your best hire often comes from within, right? The reason why is if you're actually training someone properly, they're probably going to be the most qualified person for the job. So that's something to keep an eye on, is to make sure that you look at your own people. But sometimes that doesn't work. You need somebody from the outside. Now, there are a lot of job sites out there. Indeed, there are, right? And we know that Indeed is one of them, where you can get a monster amount of resumes, right? So there are a lot of those things out there, and they will produce, and you will find people that are available to hire. But again, that doesn't mean they're always qualified. The reason why, and this is cynicism on my part, but it's actually true, is that you have a lot of people applying for jobs they're not qualified for, in part because they are on unemployment and they have to get out resumes left and right. It's just part of the nature of the business. So there's a lot of bad candidates out there, So one of the things I also suggest to clients is working through recruiters, staffing companies. Why? Because they will take on the burden of qualifying people for the business. One of my clients, I actually recommended that he use a recruiter. He rejected it initially. He was looking for a CFO, having a lot of trouble finding one. 2 years later, he had actually spent about 4 years worth of a salary on that position trying to find the right person. And so I had to do a lot of separation agreements for these individuals. But had they actually just used a recruiter, they probably would have found the right person much faster. So happens all the time. All right. And by the way, if you have any questions, please just stop me. I'm happy to talk about things as they come up. The next big point is encouraging a culture of employee engagement. With this, what I mean is you're trying to keep your employees interested in things. And how do you do that? You want to find out why they're actually staying in your business. So conducting exit interviews is common practice for a lot of companies, especially larger companies. But what companies fail to do a lot of times is to actually ask why people are staying. So I had one of my clients actually do this. They have about 150 employees. So they actually issued a survey with some interesting questions. They had me kind of review it to make sure there was nothing that they shouldn't be asking. But one of them, of course, is would you recommend this position or this company to one of your family members, right? That's a fair question. It's a good one. And if somebody's going to answer that and they say yes, then that's great. That's a good sign that they're actually enjoying their job and they would actually have their family work there. So that's a great thing. But one of the other questions is, what is it that you like about the job or what like about the employer? Getting some of the responses was kind of comical. I got to review some of those. So one, I remember a few responses. One was the coffee, right? Okay, so that's great. They had good coffee, fantastic. Another was, this one I found interesting, was that they put the receptionist, and they actually explained. And so when you see that first, you're thinking, oh gosh, that's a strange answer, and you're thinking, oh no, hopefully it's not a sexual harassment case coming, But the reality is that they actually wrote out an explanation, said the receptionist, because they always greet me with a smile and say good morning, right? That's the most pleasant human contact I have during the week. All right, that was shocking to me. I mean, it's a little bit sad, but it's actually a sign of actually something we can all learn from, of course, is having your people be personable and warm and greeting. It goes a long way. It's little things like that that actually encourage a culture for, a culture of, I don't know the best way, where they're going to want to stay at your place of employment. It can never hurt to be that way. Let's see. So again, trying to find out from employees what it is, why they're actually staying at your business is a strategy that you can use. Establishing clear-cut expectations and policies. Actually, I'm sorry, before I even move on to that, there's just another side story about actually asking people why they're going to stay. We had a vice president of a company, and there were actually multiple vice presidents at this company. I had worked with on a number of matters. He was actually leaving to go work for a competitor. I was shocked that this was happening, and I was asked by the company to issue a cease and desist letter. Do you guys know what those are? Okay, I think most of you do. So, of course, a cease and desist letter is basically giving a warning shot to an employee. You can either write one that's in a harsh way or a kind of friendly manner, but advising of their obligations to, of course, not solicit clients, not to go, to use trade secrets, et cetera, at their new place of employment. And if they do, of course, they can be subject to litigation. So I found myself having to write a letter to someone I had worked with, quite a bit, and I issued it. And then upon receipt, I got a call back from that very same person, which you usually don't. You usually get this from their counsel. But he called back just to kind of vent a little bit. And with that, I was asking, well, what's going on here? Why are you leaving? And he said, look, I've been so committed to this job, it's created issues in my marriage. All right, and that happens. We all see that. People get so committed that they put their families to the side. It's just the nature of business in America. That's the way it works. And so I was talking to him about that. And apparently he had these marital problems. I then call the CEO of my client company and talked to him about the situation. He had no idea that this was going on with his employee. And so we continued to go on and back and forth on some things. And it turns out, again, because of these marital issues, he wasn't able to spend time with his wife, going on date nights, things of that nature. And so we were able to work out something, and where he didn't leave the company. Turns out his wife is a big fan of going down to the Civic Center for Arts, like to watch Broadway type shows. And so what the company did is we were able to put something pretty creative together where he had mandatory time off for his ability to go on date nights with his wife because they bought season tickets. So that's something they could do. It was just a small thing and a weird thing, right? But we were able to work it out because we were having these open discussions. And that's one of those things you can do to get people to stay, is talk about things, you know? I think that's something that we lose in our corporate environment, is actually that human relationship. So that's just an example of how we were get a high-performing vice president to actually stay. We talk to him. Believe it or not, that's what you do. You talk to him. Okay, so the next slide we have up here is about establishing clear-cut expectations and policies. Now, this, of course, is something a company should always do regardless, is make sure your policies are very clear, that anybody can pick up something, read it, and understand what's happening. That applies whether to a policy, to a job description. But one of the things I want to talk about, too, is bonuses, or bonus agreements or commission plans. Those things need to be very clear-cut. If not, of course, that creates room for lawsuits. And you don't want those, of course. The other thing is with job duties, making sure that those are clear-cut. When people aren't sure what they're supposed to be doing, they're probably not going to be doing the right thing, right? And you can't retain employees, or you'll see people look around and leave if they don't have direction. That's a key issue here, is making sure that employees have the right direction. But again, on issues of pay or compensation, if things are kind of gray there, people aren't sure. No one likes a moving target, so to speak, when you're looking at compensation and pay. So you want to make sure those things are tightened up. I see, I would say, issues having to do with commissions and unpaid wages. I think at least weekly in my office, if not daily, for those type of issues. So it's very important to tighten those things up. You'll see that if you pay people properly and according to plan, people will stay. Okay, so another area is that you want to, or what you can help retain your employees, is to recognize employee performance. Make it routine to tell people they're doing a good job when they're doing a good job. Usually what we see today is, again, the very sterile corporate approach, and a lot of HR professionals will tell you, don't tell them they're doing a good job. It's only you tell them when they're doing a bad job. That's wrong. That is absolutely wrong. You need to encourage employees. You want to tell them what they're doing. They're doing things the right way. I had one of my clients. It used to be many years ago, as a kind of a mom and pop. It grew to be a very large corporation, and they had the same CEO for almost 50 years. Okay, so the guy started it from the ground up, got to be again very, very large corporation. And for whatever reason, I found this very odd, that they had never had a lawsuit at all during that entire time. And I was confused as to why. Like, how is this possible? Because it's not a question of if, but when, usually, right, for a lawsuit to occur. And what happened is that the CEO, and in fact his son ultimately ended up taking over, but the CEO would actually survey his managers quarterly. And he would ask for the managers to say, give me a report on some of your people. How are they doing? Tell me about some people and what they're up to, and if they're doing a good job. So he would get these quarterly reports. And then he would pick one and randomly actually go visit the employee, sit down, unexpected, meet with them, and talk, right? He would actually talk with them, find out a little bit about them, spend quality time with them. And then after that, he would actually reward them with something. So if he's talking about their family, their kids, he would send gifts, right, to kids, to them to give to the kids. But little things like that, things that reward them, even dropping off coffees, the type of coffee that somebody liked. But it was interesting to me that as soon as he left and his son took over, who did not adopt the same approach, guess what happened? Lawsuit, right? So it's little things that can make a difference, and that has to do with recognition of employees and how they're performing, and telling them, giving the encouragement. So, and I can't tell you how many times I've actually sat in depositions where I'm asking, of course, plaintiffs questions, about why they left and things of that nature. And again, this being one of the things that they feel underappreciated. If you just told them, hey, you're doing a great job, or ask them how they're doing, or how can I help you do your job, they may have still been there and not filed a lawsuit. So very important. Okay, keeping your door open. We all, well, I shouldn't say all, there are some employers who don't have employee handbooks. They should, because of those well-defined policies and practices we're talking about. But it's not just that. You want to make sure that door is open, that your manager's doors are open for employees to come in and talk to you about things. Because if you're just brushing problems to a side, eventually, of course, they're going to boil up and boil over, right? It does happen. The reason why I put this up here is because of this. One of my clients actually left another company, and he was a hard worker. He was an engineer, really bright guy, and he came in to actually start his own company. And of course, I asked, okay, what's your product? What are you doing? And he explained that what he was doing was a variation, basically a retooling of the product that he had formerly worked on at this other employer. And I asked him why he was leaving. And he said, well, my boss didn't listen to me. I had an idea that I wanted to share. And so he kept trying to schedule the opportunity to meet with him to go over these things. And every time it would just get pushed to the side, and he never met with him. Well, it turns out my client became extremely successful. His boss, who didn't listen, ended up closing his doors not long after he left. And it was basically an invention. Again, they retooled the product and are now doing contracts with the government. So very, very high-end product that they're making. But the point is that you can lose out if you don't listen to your employees, don't listen to ideas, and just shut them down and rule with an iron fist. You may lose out on something like that. And honestly, it's probably millions of dollars at this point in time, and how much was given up. The other thing to note is the company from which he left did not have non-competes, did not have non-disclosure agreements, did not have invention assignment agreements, all things that he could have actually made sure that the employee that left couldn't do on his own. So another lesson. All right. Another key aspect of retention is to keep your employees interested by investing in professional development. I'm huge on this, and this is actually even internally, even for a law firm, for me, is I like to move people around. I want to make sure that everyone knows every aspect of a business. That's big picture stuff. If all of your employees have the big picture, the inner workings of your environment, not just the cultural fit, but the who's, how's, and whys, they're going to be successful. Your organization will be successful. So don't be afraid to actually invest in your own people and actually provide additional training. Now, I'll probably talk about this in a little bit, or I will talk about this in a little bit, about when you are investing in your people. Again, it's about cross-training, making sure that they are able to do multiple things so they understand how things connect. But you're actually showing them that you're willing to invest in them, right? That's something that means a lot to employees, that you're willing to do that, willing to train and qualify them for other jobs. There's a kind of a quote out there that, look, some people may not actually ever be a CEO of a company, but you know what? You want them to feel like they could be, right? If you have all employees feeling that way, they're going to stay. They're going to feel that you're committed to them, that they're invested in the organization. So you want to make sure that you do invest in people. And there are ways. I know there's always concerns about costs as well. Like, well, geez, how much do I need to pay to send people to training? Yes, you can do that, or to get certifications. Yes, there are costs associated with it. But in the long run, you'll find that you actually save on the cost of rehiring and looking for other people if you do this. All right. Does anyone here feel overworked? Ever? None of us, right? I think that almost every one of us does. This is something that's huge, is that you want to make sure your people are not feeling overworked. There are a lot of good people out there who are going to put in the time to do a job right, and they're okay to do it. They're willing to do it. But you have to monitor that yourselves too. If you're being a good employer, you're making sure that people aren't working too much. Because why? What is it going to happen? It's going to create issues of burnout. People are going to get tired of doing the job and eventually give out. It happens. They're going then to become disinterested, looking at all the other things that they could be doing, for instance, like going to Broadway musicals, like I mentioned before. Little things like that that they're going to be looking at. So you want to encourage that work-life balance for people if you can. And also, you have to, it's a must, that your managers understand this as well. Most managers are trained to make sure that things get done, right? They don't care, do what it takes to get it done. But that mentality creates issues. If they're not looking at their employees and they're not looking to try to take care of them and making sure that they're keeping those type of balances and not being overworked, you're going to find problems. You're going to have issues under the Fair Labor Standards Act, right? Do you guys know what that is, the Fair Labor Standards Act? If for those of you who don't, it's the law which governs overtime and unpaid minimum wage. So you're going to see cases like that if they're being overworked and not monitored by management. And that's something to clearly avoid. But if you're not overworking your people, you're giving them chances to take some time to refresh, they're probably going to stay. Some other little things here, and we'll get into that there are options for not overworking people and kind of giving them some additional benefits when they have put in long hours. We can talk about that in a minute too. All right, breezing right along. Now this of course gets into the other issues here of incentives. You can incentivize people to stay. And of course, there are bonuses that you can offer, production bonuses, but retention bonuses. For those that have been long-term employees, you want to reward that. And of course, they can be discretionary, but you have the ability to reward people in a manner which the others don't. It's just at your discretion to do this. If they've been there for a long time, they've done a good job, consider coming up with retention bonuses. It could be based upon length of employment from you hit the 3-year mark, the 5-year mark, 7-year mark, whatever you want to do to reward that. Not every employer does that, but it certainly, if somebody knows that bonus is coming, maybe they're less likely to look at the competitor down the road. So that's a possibility. Those are things to consider. Other things, like I mentioned before, about training, right? If you want to invest in your people, which again I strongly encourage, if you want to invest in your people, send them to training. You can do so and put in these buyback provisions or payback provisions. So if you send somebody out, you tell them, look, if you leave in the next year or two, you'll have to pay it back. But hopefully, after they've received the training, they're not going to want to do that. They're actually going to want to stay because now there is a greater incentive for them to move up within your own organization, and you can reward them in other ways. Does anyone do that for their companies? Does anyone have yeah, that's good. Have you found that to be helpful?
Yes.
Yeah. How about you? Yeah? Okay. Yeah, I mean, I really encourage companies to do that. It's just a great way, again, to invest in your own people and keeping them or getting them to stay. Now, this is not applicable to all employers. It just depends on the size. But deferred compensation plans, stock options are things that can be offered to employees. That can get a little bit complex, but if you're a large company, it's certainly something you can do. Small companies, it's not as good. It's not as an effective tool. It's kind of harder to manage, but again, it's an option. But for me, the more important thing here is the other benefits packages that you can offer. So we all know of the typical things of insurance, health insurance, and medical, dental, et cetera, that you can offer. But there are other things that you can do to try to keep your people. And again, having interviewed or deposed clients, or even the opposite side, these are the type of things that come up. Reasons why they left, because they know of other employers that offer these other benefits. They may have had a higher paying job, but they're willing to go somewhere else where they work less, can spend more time with family. They can go on non-traditional trips such as sabbaticals. You might have a person that puts in 80 hours, a week, and they will be willing to continue that pace if you just give them, say, an additional week off, just so they can recharge the battery. But there are a lot of things that you can do in a non-traditional setting, such as, again, you have gym memberships you can offer. You can offer childcare. It varies, and it's going to vary by employee to employee a lot of times in terms of what you're actually offering and what's going to incentivize them to stay. Don't be afraid to actually offer those type of things, or to meet with employees and ask, what it is. What can I do for you? Or what can I do to try to get you to stay here? And like we said, there are different factors for different folks here. Boomers versus millennials. Everyone has their different thing, right? Just based on generation. In millennials, we have found to be more interested in things such as, other causes, where maybe that's something you can do, is allow them time to volunteer. It has been effective, at least from what I have seen. Does anyone offer any non-traditional benefits here? Yes.
Yeah, I do I'll pay for them to do volunteer work.
Okay.
They get so many hours a week, paid, they can go like do Habitat, or if they want to do whatever it is. And I don't use it as much as they could. I would like to encourage them to do it more. There's a lot of questions that you got me. I want to know, how do you force somebody to take a week vacation?
How do you force them? Get them to unplug?
It's like, I'm saying, I'm a real firm believer that they need to retool.
Mhm.
We're in the accounting kind of world, the stress level is
Sure.
horrendous, and I think they burn out. And especially my single females, they think that they should save all their time for the kid is sick or something like that, and so they'll just do like long weekends. But I really would like to encourage, I don't know if I should put it in the contract or what, that they have to take a solid week away from the office once a year, and the government doesn't force them to work.
You could do it. I mean, look, most of the individual you're talking about is probably going to be on a salary basis, right? So you're going to pay them the salary regardless. But what you can do is, you can implement, as an employer, you can require employees to take time off. It's going to be unpaid, or it will be paid based upon their position, because you're kind of trying to do it as a reward as well, right? Incentive to you said retool, to re-energize. You can do that. You can require it. You don't have to have a contract to do it. You can just give them the directive. You're going to do this. You're going to give me your phone. You're going to disconnect. You're allowed to do that. And honestly, it's a good sign if an employee doesn't want to do it, but it's a sign that they need to do it, right? I would just bring them in the office, talk to them, saying, we love you. You're doing a great job, but you can't keep this pace up. It's not healthy. It's not something you should do. We're trying to make sure that you have that work-life balance. If you're just open and honest with them about the situation, they'll probably understand. They'll work out. But you can force them to do so.
I get a lot of pushback. Open door policy makes them too friendly.
That is true. Some people will overshare. Yes, sir.
I have a different type of question. I go into like marketing companies or tech companies, and the company benefit is they have beer on tap.
Right. Mm-hmm.
How does that work in liability? I mean, my past experiences, there was no alcohol allowed even at a company event unless they bought it themselves. So you bringing in alcohol into the office,
right?
How does that work today?
Well, it's called a liability, like you mentioned. There are dram shop rules out there that actually kind of prohibit that. So an employer is really at risk if they do those type of things. They're going to have insurance, but sometimes insurance won't pay for things like that if they've actually brought it on premises. So that can be very dangerous. It is something that, I do see a lot of quote-unquote younger, like you said, tech-type companies doing to attract people because they're trying to create that college-like environment, which sets up other issues, of course, down the road. But they really shouldn't be doing that. They can go off-site if they want to do things, but, popping a beer, at work, probably not the best idea in the world, and they're just setting themselves up for other issues. But other alternatives. I have one client who actually put up video game rooms. That it's what people like. It's what they enjoy, and it does help encourage people to stay because that's an environment they can't get anywhere else. So that would be a better alternative, perhaps. Anyway, any other non-traditional benefits? Does anyone have any examples or something that they use? Does anyone else? Okay.
I have something.
Yes.
I brought in a top-of-the-line $10,000 massage chair from Japan.
Wow. And?
Not many people use it.
Really? Is it because maybe they're afraid that they can't do it, or if they're going to be deemed not working? I don't know.
No one's ever thinking about it.
Gotcha.
Even when we have clients or visitors come in, sometimes it's kind of a neat little thing.
Yeah.
If you ever try to get someone to sign a contract or something important, have that conversation while they're sitting on the chair.
Absolutely. Sign here. That's right. Yeah, absolutely. That's a great one. I actually haven't seen that one yet, so that's interesting. The fact that they're not using it could be because again, they don't know whether they're, hey, is someone going to say something negative? Yeah. Maybe you should lead by example, right? Okay, all right, all right. Okay, so this is the lawyer legal language portion of the presentation, of course. You can offer all of those other things we talked about, work with people, open door policies, find out, what it is that they like about the business, what they don't like, etc. But inevitably, some people will leave, right? We just know this. It's going to happen. You can't make everyone happy. So one thing I like to do, of course, and I encourage this of almost all employers, is to use non-compete agreements, non-solicitation agreements to help de-incentivize the turnover. But it's also a way to protect your own company from people kind of raiding your trade secrets and taking your clients. So whose company uses non-competes here? I would say, okay, so that maybe half of the room at this point in time. And naturally, with non-competes, non-solicitations, it will inevitably lead to litigation. It does. It happens. But it also serves as an opportunity. I already gave the example of where we had to send out a cease and desist, and we were able to bring somebody back. So that's what I like to use them to, is for a retention tool, is to have a conversation with the employee that's leaving, find out why they're leaving, and then, hey, is there something we can do to get them back? Then there are other times where an employer is okay with them to leave. That happens too. So I want to make sure that you guys understand that they can be tools for retention, not just to protect your assets. But something else that I have been doing for a lot of clients lately is contracts. How many of you are afraid to use an employment contract instead of just do the standard at will? Who uses contracts?
I'm afraid.
You're afraid to use them. Okay. And I would suggest that you not be afraid to use them. And the reason being is because, remember, a contract it's as good as the terms that are in it, right? Most people think that when you have a contract and it has a certain term or a length of time in it, that they're going to have to pay damages, meaning if you let the person go for short of the actual contract length, then you're going to have to pay damages up to that last date of the contract. Well, that's not true. It's all about the terms and what you actually put in there. So in essence, what you can do is basically write in the at-will portion into the contract. But there's a good thing to do with the contracts is that a lot of employees, if they go, oh, I have an employment contract, they actually feel that they have something, some little bit of leverage, or it's like a sense of comfort, right? That they have something which suggests that you're honoring them as an employee, you want them to be there, but you can actually utilize it and put a lot of things in that contract which otherwise wouldn't be in there. So you can actually use it to keep people and help retain them in a kind of creative manner, where you still have the benefits of at will. So I would strongly encourage you to start looking at things like that. Don't think that employment contract is necessarily a bad thing. It's not taboo, really. It's up to the creativity of the drafter to put in the right terms. Okay, so once people leave, again, we talked about the outset at the very beginning of finding out what it will take to keep people there, or what in order to stay. But you will have people leave, and when they do, you want to ask them, why they're leaving. How many of you actually conduct exit interviews? Okay, a few of you. How effective have you used that information to try to change the environment? Has anybody?
I found that people are so honest in an exit interview.
Mm-hmm.
You have nothing to lose.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're reasonably open-minded, they may have constructive criticisms where you can actually make adjustments.
Mm-hmm.
And if they're just whining, too bad.
It is hard, right? Sometimes to tell whether are they being honest or are they just upset because it's
well, I
sour
kind of
grapes.
look at it and say, do I think this is a problem we really have?
Mm-hmm.
In which case I ought to be doing something about
Right.
it.
Right.
Or they complain every day, they do this every day.
Mm-hmm.
But usually there's some truth in it.
Yeah. Now, I find that they're usually pretty honest.
Yeah.
Now, some people will position themselves for lawsuits. We know that. It happens too. But I think that 9 times out of 10, someone is going to be honest if they're completing it. So if you're not using that information to actually help change your environment, you should. They're vitally important documents.
Just a question.
Yeah.
I liked, who does those interviews? Let me see, show your hands. Aye? Okay. I'm gonna go around the room and ask why you don't. Why wouldn't you do an NDA?
Nobody ever leaves.
Why, just for our edification, why wouldn't you use it? Any thoughts?
I think for me, it's a lot of not very much turnover, and when there is, I usually know exactly why. It's already been an ongoing conversation. Look, I've only had like 2 leave me this last year, and it's because they had to move to Atlanta because their sisters had medical issues and they needed to go and help her out. So 2 brothers left, and everybody was like, "Oh, we love you, we miss you," right now. And it was all close. So really haven't had anything really come up that would uncover something that we didn't already know about. So it's something that I'd like to do, especially as we continue to grow. But for now, it hasn't been so much of an issue.
Alex, you're in a larger company where folks are, come and go. But I know Warren likes to say that he's got some pretty darn good retention among the part-time workers. But you've got a pretty stable long-term force. I'm just curious what's going on at the top side.
Yeah, and so we, similar to you, we don't really have that much turnover with regards to our salary team members. And so when we do have someone leave, I'm the HR director, and so I dive in pretty deeply with them as far as why. And even if for those that are retiring, we had 2 retire this year, just more so to understand, because like you said, when they are leaving, they tend to be a little more loose with what they want to share. And so then with that feedback, I then pass that on to all the executive team as far as what the perception is from our team, because we might think we're doing one thing, but how it's landing and what the actual impact is something else entirely.
Right. No, that's a great point. And so what I have found, and why I encourage my clients to actually utilize them, is that you will find that there are some of those problems, some of the policies that we've talked about maybe haven't been that clear that they will write about. And if they had actually had conversations with their managers or utilize an open door policy, they might have figured out that, oh, we do have this. Or it's not what we thought it would be. So those are great tools to use. And so I would encourage you guys to use them if you don't already. But kudos to you all if you don't have people leaving. Good for you. You guys need to come up here and speak too. Yeah, go ahead.
Anybody have any suggestions on the best way to execute an exit interview? Is it a web form you send them after they leave? Do you hand them a piece of paper, don't fill it out, come out the door?
Face to face.
Or just asking the questions?
Yeah, just sit them down, before I say goodbye. I used to hate letting anybody go. I was terrified. And then someone said, it's half an hour of your life. What do you want to happen here for the next 4 years? That helped. And then the second thing is, if they want to complain about their boss, complain about me, say they love it, but whatever. But they're more open if you'll let them talk. See, face to face was just writing. If they were unhappy, they're not going to fill it in.
I will tell you, it kind of varies, really depending on the situation and why they're leaving. If they're leaving just because of other opportunities, they're probably more willing to actually speak, face to face. Or if there's a particular issue, same thing, that hasn't been addressed. I do find, and again, because I actually do labor and employment law for both sides, so I work with employers and employees, but sometimes employees don't want to go through an exit interview simply because they have potential claims, or they will actually go through it to set themselves up for a claim. But it just depends on the issue and the scenario in which it happens in terms of the exit interviews. But you can offer both, face-to-face, but then if they're not willing to do it, send them a form. Some people are more apt to actually write something out. But it just depends on how quickly they're starting their new employment too. They may want to just get out. So they're hit or miss sometimes. Yes, sir.
My company was set up virtually, and because of that nature, and I'm in the IT business, we always assumed that it was the young people that wanted to work for our firm. What I found was I had 5 different people leave over the course of a couple of years, and I did exit interviews with all of them, and it was this nasty word I call profiling.
Okay.
That I was able to profile the folks who left, and it was amazing to me that they were all similar. They were all young.
Okay.
They couldn't handle working from home. they all wanted to be in an office where there were other people.
Sure.
Where they could go out on Friday nights and do all kinds of stuff and be in the midst.
Right.
So I said, whoa, well, then maybe I need to change the target person that I'm looking for.
Mm-hmm.
And none of those folks have left.
Right.
They all, because they're working from home, they were all in their mid-30s, they all had kids, they all enjoyed the ability to stay home
Yeah.
and have dinner and laundry done while they were working.
You got it.
And that type of thing. So I
Right.
was able to change the target person I'm hiring,
Mm-hmm.
and those folks are staying around.
Yeah, that's a great point. And what you identified is what I see a lot of companies kind of suffer with, especially when they offer the work from home options. This is kind of it's not just your business, but it's a lot of businesses who have the same issue, where they have a younger workforce and they think, oh, this is a great benefit to have, but it turns out to be the opposite, where they'll end up doing other things, but they like the social interaction. I have found that the millennials are more social in nature, and so they do like that engagement. But those who appreciate that are the ones you identify, those that have children or other responsibilities at home. So it's a great way, a great thing to do is to start targeting people based upon that. Now, profiling, as you said, is probably not a great word, but you can kind of look lawfully for a certain area, those that might appreciate it, those that have more experience in the workforce, who might like that option. So good things to look at depending on your business. It's a great point. Yes, sir.
As an employer, if an employee advises you that they're leaving, and you suspect they are going to get a claim against you for any reason, would you recommend having an interview with them and sitting down with them and talking about that, or as an employment lawyer, would you come back and say, why in the world would you decide to
Right, no, it's a good question. Great question. Actually, I would suggest that you talk to them. The reason is because you are going to take your notes, right, at that time during that interview, and you're going to write down everything you possibly can. You want to document because ultimately somebody is going to be inconsistent, and more times than not it will be the employee, right? When I'm facing, let's put it this way, if I have my plaintiff's hat on and I'm facing a claim and I see that your notes were contemporaneous, right, taken at that time of that interview, that is going to carry more weight to a jury, it's going to carry more weight to a judge than not having that at all. Okay, because otherwise it's going to be your word versus theirs, where otherwise you can use those notes, right? So I would recommend it.
One thing we used to do is we had two people in the exit interviews, like their manager and like myself, and then we would write down what we thought happened at the exit interview, and then we put both of those in the file for future reference.
Yeah, no, that's
Instead of
great.
just one person.
Yeah, it's great. That's a good point. Usually, clients, depends on the size of the employer, but you'll have an HR person. You'll also have, the person's manager usually in there, and you'll take notes, like you said, and kind of in duplicate and actually compare those notes, or at least have one person, and that way they can sign off on it as well, saying, yes, this is how it occurred. That's vitally important. It's great for me, especially if I'm defending against a charge of discrimination. If someone's saying that their termination was discriminatory, that's excellent evidence for me to use to give to the EEOC to say, no, that's not what happened at all, or they had a chance to actually tell their story and complain of discrimination at that time, but they didn't do it. So you're aware of this too through third-party investigations. That can be great evidence when you have those contemporaneous notes. So, anyone else? Yes.
What are your thoughts on having a third party do that exit interview? Does the former employee potentially open up more and give information as opposed to talking to someone they used to work with?
Sure. Yes, that's a great question. I would say if the person who usually would conduct the exit interview, like an HR person, if they have been involved at all, right? For instance, if the employee has complained of an issue, discrimination, something, and it didn't get resolved to their satisfaction, yes, a third party would be recommended. It's great because you might be able to get them to open up. And that doesn't mean you actually have to go outside of your company, but you might be able to use someone else who was away from them to be able to conduct that interview. So,
An attorney.
an attorney can do it. Sometimes attorneys will not do it. We'll use a third party to do it as well, only because we can become fact witnesses, at that process. It just depends on the relationship to the client. If you don't have one at all and have never given them advice on issues, then it's not as problematic. But it just varies depending on the relationship, to be honest with you. Somebody else had their hand. Yes?
To what extent, if you're letting someone go, to what extent are you able to hold up their severance package in return for a waiver of claims?
Sure, okay, great question too. So severance packages, as we should know, are not guaranteed in the state of Florida. It's not something you actually have to offer. They're available, it's a benefit, right? And most companies are using it for the idea of peace of mind, right? In order to have somebody sign off on an agreement, a waiver of rights, in exchange for some sum of money. That's what they're doing. They're wanting to waive claims so they don't have to worry about lawsuits. They're great tools, but can you actually hold up? It depends. If it's part of a larger, like a reduction in force, where you're offering it to multiple people, you really can't do that, because you're trying to treat everyone the same who's part of that reduction in force. But if it's an individual situation, again, you don't have to offer it all. Now, you can do it as incentive, of course, to get them to sign, but you're not required to offer severance. How many people do that as a matter of course? If you have somebody leaving an organization, do you just offer it in general? Okay? Not many, it looks like. And that's fine. I like to. When I have people leave companies, I suggest to my clients, even if it's a nominal amount, if they're willing to sign off on it and waive their rights to claims, get them to do so. I mean, like I said, peace of mind is something that's great. You all know that there are some claims that cannot be waived, right? For instance, claims under the Fair Labor Standards Act, those that we talked about for overtime. Be mindful of that when you offer your severance agreements or separation agreements, that there are things that can't be waived. But what you can do in those agreements is tweak them so that they're less likely to be able to file a lawsuit afterwards and recoup some dollars. One thing I like to put in there is that they have an indication that they've been paid for all hours worked, okay? If you put that in there and they sign off, and sometimes even do it through an affidavit or a declaration, that's going to carry a lot of weight when you go to court. And they're saying that they're due 20 hours of overtime per week for 2, possibly 3 years. That's a substantial sum. But if they've signed off saying that they've actually been paid for all hours worked, a jury is not really going to believe them at that point in time. They're going to say, well, you accepted these other dollars and you made this attestation saying that you actually were paid correctly. So that can be actually a good tool too. Any other? Yes, ma'am.
Oh, I just have an example of being horrified. When I first started my business, I brought in a guy with me from another company and made him my senior VP and ran everything pretty much. And he was with me for 20-something years, but what he had put into our hand policy and everything was that you could always carry over your unused sick leave or whatever. And when he left, I had to pay him 8 months of salary after he was gone.
Wow.
Which I changed as soon as he was gone.
Yes, that's advisable. Okay, that's a great point, though. So in terms of when you put in those clearly defined policies that we talked about, you want to make sure that you're following them correctly. So one thing that's always kind of an open-ended subject, or I see a lot of, is that very scenario of what happens if you have accrued but unused vacation, sick leave, etc. What happens to it? Are you required to pay it out? The answer is no, unless your policy states so, or if you don't have a policy, if you've actually paid someone else out in the past, you now have to pay everyone else out for that vacation or unused sick time. The reason why is because at that point it becomes wages under Florida law. Okay, it's a tricky issue to deal with if people don't have clearly defined policies. But that's usually what you defer to. But otherwise, if there is no policy and you haven't paid employees in the past for the accrued but unused time, you're not required to under law. The state of Florida does not require you to do so. So keep that in mind when you are creating those policies. It can be a benefit, but it can also harm you as well. So, yes, sir.
So about 18 months ago, I took my company virtual.
Okay.
For 3 years, I had a staff. Can you talk a little bit about now that my company's virtual, I have 1099, relationships versus an employee relationship.
Okay.
A little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, let me ask you a couple questions first, right? So are you treating them the same? Are they just...
Absolutely not.
Okay, well, okay, that's the key characteristic here. If we're talking about being virtual and you have 1099s, which could be a great model, I mean, cost savings model for sure, you want to make sure that you're not exercising too much control over those individuals. You're really putting a lot on them for them to be able to do their own work, to be able to hit their specific objectives, right? Kind of like their own business unit. If you're treating them that way, then that's fantastic. That's exactly how that relationship would work, where you haven't misclassified them, right? An independent contractor when they should have been an employee. But there are still issues when you have people like that. They may leave and go look at other opportunities as well. So in terms of the retention for them, is that what your question is? How can you retain them? Or?
Basically, to stay out of having any issues with collecting payroll taxes and for non-competes. So
Well-
now that everybody's virtual,
Great.
I don't have non-compete, I don't have contractual agreements because they're 1099. I'm not
Well,
gonna-
1099s, I still would encourage you to actually have agreements to set forth the terms. Your payroll tax is a non-issue at this point in time, but you still need those terms, so that way you have a clear understanding between the two of you, or between you and the employees, for what that relationship is. Non-competes, believe it or not, state of Florida actually allows you to enforce non-competes against independent contractors. So it's one of the few states that actually does do that. So you can actually have them, not go work for a competitor or work, start their own business. So I would encourage you to use those.
On that, on the 1099 issue, just see how it goes. It'll come back.
Okay.
Well, I will tell you,
Well,
I had another colleague in another state do this, and he was not having a proper relationship with his 1099s, and the state came back and wanted payroll taxes.
Yeah.
And he was like, what do you mean? They're not my employees, and it was a big deal.
Yeah, it-
That lost a lot of money.
It all has to do with the amount of control that's being exercised over them. So,
Okay.
is that,
This is the thing, because if,
this is the accountant side, the control theory? or-
No, this is actually, there are those who treat them as independent contractors, but the only work relationship they have is with, for example, you.
Right.
Okay, so even if it's 20 hours a week, it might be 40 hours a week.
Mhm.
But I'll just use an example. If he's the only relationship, is there a true independent contractor relationship or not?
The issue is, and the answer can be yes. You can still have an independent, even if they're working 40 hours and you're the only one they actually work for, that doesn't destroy the issue of independent contractor status. It's really, do they have the opportunity to go work for someone else? And the answer should always be yes. What I mean by that is that they're available to take on other jobs. You can't control that at this point. Once you make them an independent contractor, you give up that ability to tell them, right?
But you had mentioned that I could have a non-compete
You
with the same
can.
person who's my creative director, he only does work for Patterson Bach, and now I'm also saying, oh, and by the way, I don't want you to deal with your creative work for anybody else in the market.
Well, that would be overbroad, and that's where you get into the nuances of what a non-compete should and shouldn't say. So when you get into the nuances here, you have to make sure that it hits all the high points of what the statute allows, okay? Making sure it's limited in geographic scope, it's designed to protect a certain business interest, it's not overbroad, the length of time. Those are the parameters you're working with, but you are able to do that. The point is that they could still do contracting, for instance, let's say that you decided, okay, I want to put a 3-county restriction, right, for where they can do work. That's fine, but if they were to go and do independent contracting work for someone outside of those counties, they're not prohibited from doing so, right? You can't control that. So they're not inconsistent ideas there, if that answers the question, yeah.
I'm Agnes Berger with Grennan Fender CPAs. I've actually dealt with your situation via an audit for one of my clients, a payroll audit. And what determined whether or not it was an independent contract was actually a contract. The IRS was looking for that contract, and they were looking for the amount of control that that employer had over the employee. In my situation, that particular employee was a vice president level employee, and the IRS was looking at it.
Sure.
So it's like, because they didn't have a contract, they didn't have anything spelled out in there that says, you can work for whoever you want, here's your responsibilities, here's your terms, you are a non-employee.
So the contract would be very beneficial.
It would be
Absolutely.
very beneficial. You want to, basically the IRS looks at, I think this is
Yeah,
a step process.
their IRS has
Yeah.
16, they have 16 elements they actually consider when looking at these things. But a contract is evidence of one of those.
And you're forming that contract knowing that the IRS is going to look at these 16 things.
Absolutely.
So you want to make sure that that's included in those contracts.
The contract is intended to document intent of the parties to form that type of relationship. That's what they're looking for. So the vice president issue, that's different because of the type of position. They're probably, of course, they would probably deem an employee in that scenario, right? Yeah. But so the IRS has its own test. It's about 16 points. Then you have the Department of Labor who has another test. There are multiple. And then you have the courts. They also have their additional tests. Some adopt the IRS test, some adopt the Department of Labor. So the main thing you want to do when you have independent contractors is that they meet both tests. That's how you handle it. But an agreement itself is indicative of that relationship, but not on its own. There have to be the other factors as well. So, yes?
Two questions, one
Sure.
really quick. What percentage of lawsuits do you see on the hiring process versus the exiting and separation?
Right.
And then the second question would be, what key things would you suggest as far as text, emails, documentation that would be important on the exiting process?
Okay, great questions. On the hiring process, I would say less than 1%, to be honest with you. Hiring is usually, the reason why is because there's less evidence, to be honest, at that step. So you usually don't see many lawsuits generating from failure to hire. That's really the term that we like to use in our industry. So they're fairly rare, to be honest. The one you see most often in that scenario is actually on the age side. I think that's the most common of the failure to hire, but also the most disfavored by the courts. Courts are not favorable to age claims, to be honest with you. They have different standards. So the second question, you're asking about the importance of documentation, text messages, things of that nature for the exit side. And obviously, any document, if I'm an attorney, is going to be important. But it depends on the industry as well. Okay, and what I mean by that is, if some of you are involved in the recruiting industry, right? You have software which you actually document things for candidates who are using or talking to your salespeople. Bullhorn. I don't know if you use Bullhorn. If any of your people use Bullhorn, there are things that cannot go away once they're entered. So that can be very scary for an employment attorney when some information is entered which shouldn't otherwise be there. What I mean by that is, say a candidate calls up or they're looking to, for a job, and they mention certain things to the recruiter. The recruiter documents it, but they're phrased in a way which it does appear discriminatory. That situation, the documentation is bad news because it's there, it's locked in forever. We can't hide that. We have to disclose it to the EEOC. It's there. But text messaging is an interesting thing. I like to use those when I can, but let's be honest, texts are hard to recover sometimes, depending on, we can usually only get them through a subpoena. And even then it's very hard that the companies, the cell phone companies actually put up a big fight for us to get that information. But if you have it available, then great. That's fantastic. Yes?
What issues are you running into with employees with drug policies now that you've got cannabis legal in certain states?
Yeah. That's now a developing area of the law, clearly. It is interesting because I represent some companies that do national recruiting, and so I'm trying to stay on top of those across the country. And not a single one is the same in other jurisdictions. Like you look and they all vary. So it's a very complicated question when you get into those. And they're hard to stay up on top of because some legislation is being passed, but then they don't go into effect for a couple of years. That's just the way that it's worked. But they're very hard to stay up on, to be honest with you, because you have cities, you have like local ordinances. Everyone's deciding to adopt their own policies with respect to drug testing and what's marijuana, especially of course of medical marijuana. Then there's some for recreational. I think Maine is one that allows. I think they are, believe it or not, Maine is one of the places which protects the recreational use at all times unless it's actually on the employer's premises. It's kind of scary actually because you don't know how to regulate it in terms of an employer. It's just a tough area to deal with right now. So I wish I could give you more direction. It's really hard to define.
Has there been any cases for work comp that have been settled due to an injury claim from marijuana?
I haven't seen any, to be honest with you, but you're really not going to see if it's settled. Usually, I mean, what you're looking for us to use as precedent is those cases that have gone all the way through and have some type of decision or judgment. So unfortunately, I can't tell you on the settlement side.
Not the settlement,
Right.
the judgment
Right.
side.
I haven't seen any judgments yet.
Right.
Yes,
I have
ma'am.
a question. It's a follow-up to this.
Yes.
In our industry, we're geotechnical engineers and materials testing engineers. So we operate a lot of equipment, heavy equipment,
Sure.
very dangerous equipment. This whole drug thing is scaring me.
Yes.
Because it's liability for us.
Mhm.
Because I mean, okay, maybe they're not doing it on our premises, but they did it last night.
Mhm.
And then they come in, exactly. So
Right. Here's the answer I've given to a client about a similar issue. When it becomes an issue of safety, forget what the law, and this is, again, me just, telling them, forget the law. Even if it required them to actually, said that they could operate a vehicle, I would err on the side of caution because you're going to have a more costly lawsuit, and, it could be lives in danger of your employees, of others on the outside as well. So, if you're trying to balance between the two, take a penalty or try to resolve it. You could probably resolve the issue with the individual who, of course, is using the drugs at that point in time versus the larger issue. So I know it's hard and it's not easy to take, and it's like you're telling me to violate the law. It depends on the situation, but I haven't actually advised someone that you can't put the safety of your people at risk. So, yeah.
Isn't there a federal law that comes that?
Which part?
The cannabis, isn't that still on the, or did that change?
It's changing constantly right now. There's no definitive thing that I can walk in here and tell you, hey, here's the rule of thumb on that area of the law right now. It is literally changing by the day.
But I mean, on the narcotics list, for whatever reason.
Yeah, there are certain narcotics, right, which, there are lists.
Cannabis, right?
I'm sorry?
Cannabis.
What about cannabis?
It was on the list at one point.
Right.
It was on that list.
Right.
So it's a federal offense as well.
Right, but now things are being removed, though, from that. And it just depends on the level of cannabis, too. So those are things that when you're creating policies, you have to be very consistent with your state that, A, there's federal law to consider, but also the states, too. For recruiters and staffing agencies, that's a very tough issue to deal with right now. Very tough. Oh, okay, we have 5 minutes. Who's got more questions for us? Yes, sir.
Rewinding back to the recruitment process, so a lot of companies are adopting these, and I want to get your thoughts on it. The whole the personality, behavioral, social profiling assessments and how effective they are, and what have you run into with as far as how much these companies are actually using that type of software and what its effectiveness is?
Yeah, actually, again, that's something that companies are starting to use a lot more of, and I'm actually okay with those. And I have found that the issue being is that usually when you have something like that, there's always the concern, okay, is this going to be a discriminatory process, right? Ultimately, is that what somebody's going to use? I haven't seen that enough to say that I would ever recommend a company not to use it. If there are good factors in there that have been linked to a worker who's going to be productive for you, a good hire, then I would strongly encourage the use of it. So I think you might hear some more about those today, and I think they're great. I think they're great tools and usually indicative of performance for employees. So if there's one that fits your organization, use it.
I have to throw back to 30 years ago. When I started in the industry, I had to take 3 days of psychological examinations of what type of personality I was, and they never could figure it out. I have an interesting question just on the thought. I have been literally salivating over an individual for a number of years to hire. And he would join me in a heartbeat, and both of us have been very leery, because I'm not a big 500, Fortune 500 company, but she works for it. He does have a non-compete. And I'm not even sure who is liable for that, whether if I hired him, he would get sued, I would get sued. I don't even know the dynamics of all of that.
Great question. You both could be sued. But that doesn't mean you always will. Like I said earlier, there's a chance, right? The way I look at it is there's always room to negotiate. And worst case is they say no, right? I mean, that's really what it is, and you still don't get the person. But if you really want that person, one idea you could do is contact an attorney and have them contact the company for you and see if there's a negotiation to be had, because it may be that you could work something out. So don't give up, go for it. There's a possibility. But in the end, if you were not able to work something out and it was an enforceable agreement, you as the employer obviously could be sued for what's called tortious interference with existing contractual relationship. Okay? Yes?
How enforceable are non-competes in the case that somebody's terminated?
Oh, very. So it depends on the wording of the agreement itself, because there are some that will limit it to certain circumstances. But generally, I will tell you all that whether somebody resigns or they're terminated or any other reason, it's still going to be enforceable if everything else meets the criteria of the law. Okay, so judges really don't care, but it's really going to be what's in the agreement. Okay, but if they're terminated, I will want to say one thing, and I know we're about done here, but for defenses to non-competes, okay? Yeah, I've been doing this 16 years. I've only lost one case, and it was a non-compete issue where I thought I had a better argument than they did, but it just didn't turn out to be true because we found out something after the fact that the employee was not paid correctly, okay, during their term. So we had an otherwise enforceable agreement, but I had no defense. I didn't even know that the person wasn't paid correctly, but they had absolute proof of it, okay? And so those things, what we call prior material breach or unclean hands, that if you want to enforce a non-compete, you better make sure that you've done everything right by that employee if you're going to go to a judge. So that's one of the areas where you can find that they're really not enforceable when they're otherwise would be, okay? Yes.
One more question.
Yes.
So we talked about the hiring side and how it's like, okay, there's 1% of all claims, 99% is, the employee conflict. What are kind of like top 5 main issues that end up coming up as lawsuits?
Top 5 that I see that come through the door?
Yeah,
Okay.
just top 5, like general topic.
Sure. Pay is number one, right? So if somebody's not been paid correctly, I would always forewarn everyone to make sure that people are classified properly. So you're going to see the overtime issues. You're going to see unpaid commissions because the policies are not well defined, the incentive plans. You can never get away with discrimination claims. They're always there. Leave and ADA are the next 2. So family medical leave, a lot of you have enough employees to qualify. So that area is often abused. And then just general accommodations. When you do have someone who has a known disability, a lot of employers refuse to actually accommodate when they shouldn't. They should allow their basic things that they can actually do, but they just think it's a hassle, so they don't. So ADA accommodation is a huge area. Let's see, non-competes, like I said earlier, that might even be number 1 at this point in time. So one thing, I'll leave you with this. Retention does boil down to this. It really, to this one question, do you treat your employees with integrity as if they are human beings with their own needs, personal lives, and goals, and who are worthy of respect? If you can say yes, you're going to be retaining your employees. If not, you're going to be having lawsuits. Okay? So, thank you very much.
As I do, whenever you have an attorney in a forum like this, you can probably go all